Dr. Goldhamer, the founder of True North, the quintessential American, in my opinion, one who solves problems. Please take it away.
Okay. So today I wanted to talk about a hidden force that undermines health and happiness. We call it the pleasure trap. It involves the artificial stimulation of dopamine in your brain. Dopamine is the neurochemical associated with pleasure.
Dr. Goldhamer,
Yeah.
excuse me for interrupting, but your PowerPoint is not on the full screen, and I thought you might want to start over. We'll edit.
Okay. Let's see if we can, does that look better?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. So this pleasure trap is this hidden force. It's actually responsible for why people are having many of the challenges they are with their health. And as I mentioned, it's involving a neurochemical called dopamine. Dopamine is normally the neurochemical that's associated with pleasure. So the problem with dopamine is if you artificially stimulate dopamine, as you would say, for example, in drug addiction, you can actually become addicted to it. You can have to use this substance not only to seek the pleasure that's dopamine associates, but you have to continue to use it to avoid the pain of withdrawal, which is kind of the hallmark of addiction. Alcohol, good example. People drink alcohol, they like the way it makes them feel, but if they keep drinking alcohol, they can actually become addicted to alcohol. We call it alcoholism, and they have to keep drinking to avoid feeling very bad. Cocaine is another example. Cocaine, a highly concentrated substance that stimulates significant dopamine in the brain. In fact, it simulates so much dopamine. If you consider how much dopamine is released when you have an orgasm during sex versus smoking cocaine, there's 10 times more dopamine released smoking cocaine. You can imagine how reinforcing that is. I remember I was in Los Angeles giving a talk, and I mentioned this point about cocaine, and there was a woman in the audience. She was probably in her late 80s, and she interrupted me and she said, "Excuse me, Dr. Goldhamer, where would I get cocaine from?" But that's not the point. It turns out there's also chemicals that you can put into the food supply that will stimulate dopamine in the brain, and it will lead to overeating. For example, rodents given access to these chemicals will increase their body weight 49% in 60 days. Birds given access to these chemicals will get so fat they can't even fly. And it turns out that it works in people as well. And it's responsible for the obesity that's epidemic in our society and industrialized societies today. There are specific chemicals that are added to the food supply that make them more appealing and increase their consumption. That makes them more appealing because when you put them in your mouth, you'll get more dopamine stimulated in the brain than you would otherwise. One of those chemicals is C6H12O6, which is also known as sugar. Sugar doesn't exist in a concentrated form in a natural setting. In fact, you have to go through quite a bit of effort in order to be able to form it. But today, this particular chemical is consumed around 150 pounds per year per person, 60 pounds of which is in added highly processed sugars. And when you think about it, I mean, I don't eat any of the added sugars, which means somebody's eating my share as well. So people are consuming an awful lot of this particular white substance. There's also this chemical, which is also known as oil. Oil also doesn't exist in a natural setting in a concentrated form. It has 9 calories per gram. It's highly concentrated. And what's even worse is we take it and we heat it at high temperature. And then we use it to turn potatoes and other substances into sponges and soak it up. I tell my patients, instead of eating fried foods, what they probably should do is find the deep fryer, just stick their head in it and suck, because that's what they're doing when they're eating fried foods. And there's also another white powdery substance called salt. Although it's an essential nutrient in the quantities found in whole foods, when it's added in concentrated form, it contributes significantly to ill health, not the least of which is obesity. And that's an interesting thought when you realize that salt has no calories, yet it makes people fat. And the way it does that is by stimulating what's called passive overeating. If you eat to satiety or till you're satisfied of any given food substance, and then compare that to eating the same substances when it's salted, you'll find you eat more of the salted substances before you feel satisfied. And people say, well, yeah, because it tastes better. Well, that's correct. That's what tasting better means, is that whatever the substance you're putting in your mouth stimulates more dopamine production. And so even though salt contains no calories, it's responsible for helping sustain obesity. American Heart Association says that you only need 500 milligrams of sodium per day, but the average American is currently consuming 3,400 milligrams per day. And this overeating is leading to significant challenges. We make foods with these chemicals added to our base. We'll take something like potatoes with 500 calories a pound and turn it into something called potato chips with 2,500 calories a pound. And that stimulates more dopamine in the brain. And so when you compare how much dopamine is stimulated eating, say, whole natural foods with 150 calories per pound, your brain responds negatively. And the reason is that your brain is designed for an environment of scarcity. So the higher the caloric density, the more valuable your brain perceives it. So salt, oil, and sugar, or SOS, are the chemicals added to food that are making us achieve obesity and its consequences. And that's why we advocate a vegan, SOS-free diet, a diet without the addition of these chemicals. The consequence of the salt, oil, and sugar in the diet are that 72% of people living in industrialized countries are now overweight or obese. And, you know, it makes sense. The biological imperative of life is get enough to eat and don't get eaten. Most human beings that were born on this planet did not live long enough to reproduce. They did not pass on their genes. The ones that did were the ones that were able to overcome this biological imperative of scarcity. It's not surprising that the two natural behaviors that stimulate dopamine production are feeding and sexual behavior, because it's food and sex that are the critical biological imperatives of life. Get enough to eat, don't get eaten. Food and sex, food and sex, food and sex. Unless you're a male, of course, then it's entirely different. But regardless, you get the point. The modern human brain is biologically identical to the ancient human brain of, say, 100,000 years ago, according to the anthropologists. That 100,000 years is not enough time to see evolutionary pressures and change. So the brain in your head today is essentially the same brain in the head of a modern human 100,000 years ago. The way the brain works is it stimulates behaviors that favor survival and reproduction. It does that in an environment of scarcity, in the natural environment which the brain evolved. This is the environment that your brain lived in for 99,800 years of the last 100,000 years. This is the environment of scarcity that you were designed for. But about 200 years ago, with the Industrial Revolution, innovative human beings changed the face of the planet, and not the least of which they changed how our foods are processed. And so now our foods come from places that look like this. And we've dramatically increased caloric density, making those foods more appealing. Salad, for example, 100 calories a pound. So if you were going to try to live on salad, you'd have to eat 20 pounds a day in order to be able to get enough calories to survive. And honestly, even if you started eating salad in the morning at 6 a.m. and didn't stop till midnight, it would still be a huge challenge to get 20 pounds of food in a day. So when your brain experiences salad, it understands it's food, but it's not excited about it because it realizes that this is not a valuable food that's going to allow us to sustain our existence. Fruit, for example, has 300 calories a pound, 3 times the caloric density. It's more appealing to people than salad because it has higher caloric density. Although you'd need 20 pounds of salad a day, you'd only need about 7 pounds of fruit. And although it still would be a full-time job, theoretically, at least you could get enough calories in. Potatoes, rice, and beans, higher caloric density. It's used to dextrinize the starches, 500 calories a pound. You'd only need 4 pounds of potatoes, rice, and beans a day. And, you know, if you were hungry, your preference would be the higher caloric density foods. But what if we invented a food that does not exist in nature, but had 1,200 calories a pound? So you can imagine your brain would respond favorably because you would only need less than 2 pounds of food of this food a day in order to get enough to survive. So it would be perceived as very valuable by the brain. And that food, if it was introduced in the 1800s at the World's Fair, would receive rave reviews, and it did. And that food is called ice cream. Ice cream is a highly concentrated substance. In fact, if you melt ice cream into a liquid, it's described as sickly sweet. Yet when it's cold, it tastes very appealing. And the reason is when your natural tasting mechanisms are not designed for something artificially cold like ice cream. You've never, for example, fallen into an ice cream pond. It doesn't exist in nature. And it turns out when something's very cold like that, your taste perceptions don't work very well. So in order to make ice cream appealing, you have to super saturate it with sugar. So when you melt ice cream and you taste it and you describe it as sickly sweet, it has the same amount of sugar in it that it would when it was artificially cold. It's just now you can taste what's there. It's just as concentrated when it's cold. You just don't know it because your taste mechanisms have been fooled by its consistency. What if you invented a food that was a higher caloric density than ice cream? Do you think that it would have appeal? And do you think we would call it, I don't know, the staff of life? Bread has 1,500 calories a pound because what you've done is you've taken a 500 calorie a pound grain and then ground it into a flour, dehydrated, added oil, salt to it, and you have a very concentrated substance. And that's before you turn it into a butter boat and spread coagulated cow pus over it, increasing caloric density even further. I mean, pure sugar only has 1,800 calories a pound. When you realize bread has 1,500 calories a pound, you realize it's very close to the same consistency. And yet you don't go into a restaurant and find the sugar on the table and take 10 of those packets and eat 10 packets of sugar before you order your food. And yet, people, how many teaspoons of sugar do you think are in one of these? That's right, 10. In fact, the new Coke, which was even sweeter, has 11. I think they used to have trouble getting more sugar in it without it coming into solution, but figured out, I think it's more phosphoric acid or something allows them to put even more sugar in. And the sweeter it is, the more valuable it's perceived by the brain. And then, of course, if you add, they used to use cocaine, but now they've got an even better drug. It's called caffeine that they put in there. It's highly addictive. You make this very appealing beverage. And it used to be that a 12-ounce Coke was a special treat, but no more. Now we have the big gulp, the super big gulp, the double gulp, and the express gulp with free refills. And I'm pretty sure soon we're going to need an even bigger substance in order to be able to get our fix. Today, 25% of calories of teenagers come from the sugar and soda pop alone. Just the sugar-sweetened beverages make up a significant portion of the calories of our young people, and yet we don't understand how it is that obesity is becoming so epidemic. Oh, and what about something with an even higher caloric density? How about 2,500 calories a pound? Do you think people would like that? What if we called it chocolate? Chocolate has 2,500 calories a pound. I tell patients instead of eating chocolate, they should just melt it and then rub it all over their belly and hips where it's going to end up. And that way they wouldn't have to wear it all day. They could just wash it off. There was actually there was a survey of women, not men, just women. And they asked women, what would you rather do, have mad, hot, passionate sex or eat chocolate? And the two most common responses were, what kind of chocolate and how many pieces are we talking about? The problem with this dietary pleasure trap is that it makes us fat. And that fat has two components. It's your regular subcutaneous fat and also visceral fat. And visceral fat appears to be the specific problem. That's the fat that accumulates around your belly and your organs. And it's associated with the production of IL-6 and TNF-alpha and other inflammatory markers. It's hypertrophic, hyperplastic, and hypermetabolic. It's acting like a tumor. So an individual that has significant pounds of visceral fat essentially has a several pound tumor in their body. And so it's not surprising that the higher the visceral fat, the higher the association of cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, autoimmune disease, type 2 diabetes, and cancer. The more visceral fat, the more vulnerable we are to infectious disease. For example, in our most recent COVID issue, one of the biggest predictors of vulnerability to COVID, that is dying from being exposed to that particular virus, was obesity. The more visceral fat you had, the more vulnerable you appear to be. It's called the pleasure trap, a hidden force that undermines health and happiness. And the dietary pleasure trap is the major factor responsible for obesity and all of its downstream consequences. And it's very difficult to escape a pleasure trap. It's one of the more difficult things that patients will ever do in their life, is attempt to escape this trap. For example, alcoholics. 18% of recovering alcoholics are able to abstain drinking for 1 year. If they go to an inpatient program, go to 90 visits in 90 days, have family support. That means 82% will fail in their focused attempts to quit drinking alcohol for 1 year. Heroin addiction, for example, only 10% of heroin addicts are able to abstain from the use of heroin for 1 year, even going through the most successful treatment programs. But if an individual wants to lose 5% of their body weight, so a relatively modest body weight loss, and maintain that body weight loss for 1 year, it turns out only 5% of people under any of the programs available are successful. That means there's a 95% failure rate in trying to achieve and maintain weight loss. And if an individual has a BMI over 40, so they've got significant obesity, and they're a male, the chance of them ever losing their weight and achieving a healthy weight is 1 in 1,290. For women, it's higher, 1 in 667 can achieve and maintain a healthy weight. So a 99.99% failure rate. A heroin addict is more likely to succeed at quitting heroin than an overweight person is at getting weight off and keeping it off. If you look at the percentage of Americans that have these 4 fundamental habits, that is, being sufficiently active so they're engaged in regular exercise, they do not smoke cigarettes, they eat what's very broadly defined as a, quote, healthy diet, not necessarily as restrictive as what you and I might be advocating. That is a whole plant food SOS-free diet. And have a healthy body fat weight, so 10 to 20% body fat for a male, 20 to 25% body fat for a female. The percentage of people that currently achieve that is 2.7%. This is a chart of the United States that presents self-reported obesity. So these are the people that report that their weight has allowed them to achieve the exalted state of obesity. This is the percentage of people in the states that have achieved obesity. Now, this was presented by the Center for Disease Control, and it is proof positive that the people at the CDC are optimists, because although no state has managed to achieve obesity in the majority of its patients, that is a BMI of greater than 30, the folks at the CDC are so optimistic that we will be able to achieve that goal that they've put it on the chart here. There are 3 states that are leading obesity here: West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, kind of home of deep fried ice cream. But there's only a couple states, you can see the yellow states, that have a little bit lower percent obesity. The state in the country that has the lowest reported obesity is Washington, D.C. Now, what's interesting about this graph is this is self-reported obesity, and it turns out people lie. And when they actually analyzed it, it turns out these numbers are 40% lower than in reality, because the fact is people lie about their weight, and they almost always lie saying that they're smaller than they are. They never lie saying they're bigger than they are. So that means that the people in Washington, D.C. are either the smallest overeaters or the biggest liars. "93% of people in industrialized countries, 93% of the calories of people in industrialized countries come from either animal food or highly processed pleasure trap chemicals. So that's meat, fish, fowl, eggs, oil, salt, and sugar. 7% of calories come from fruits and vegetables, and a third of that is potatoes, served mostly as French fries or potato chips. So fruits and vegetables are not even a statistically significant percentage of the calories of people living in industrialized countries. They've become the decoration on the plate. And what we do is we spend trillions of dollars on the leading cause of death: heart disease, cancer, and stroke. We spend tremendous amount of resources on everything from stents and bypass to various pharmaceutical surgeries, with very disappointing results, having limited effect on all-cause mortality and certainly on morbidity. So we aren't making people necessarily live longer or necessarily better, because instead of spending our money on the leading cause of death, what we might consider doing is focusing on the actual causes of death, the reason people get heart disease, cancer, and stroke. And the reason people get heart disease, cancer, and stroke, the actual causes of death, are the use of tobacco and alcohol and eating a diet high in highly refined carbohydrates and animal-based products. But what we do instead as a society is encourage people to eat health food: olive oil and red wine and dark chocolate and diet sodas and white meats and low-fat dairy products, and encourage, high protein, high fat Atkins diets and keto diets. What I think we should do is actually focus on healthy foods, which have nothing to do with health foods. Healthy foods are fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, a whole plant food, SOS-free diet. So the solution is focus on a diet exclusively from whole plant foods that's free of added salt, oil, and sugar. Don't eat 3 to 4 hours before you go to sleep at night, so that the calories that you eat or have a chance to be burned rather than stored as fat, and that the quality of your sleep can be improved. And exercise. So whether it's walking, hiking, biking, swimming, getting regular aerobic exercise to maintain flexibility, strength, and endurance. Healthy diet would include, as we said, fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, a whole plant food, SOS-free diet. This is the type of food that human beings have eaten for 99,800 of our modern history. And this is the type of diet that we've been eating for the last 200 years, progressively. Now, I want you to look very carefully. Can you tell a difference. Because if you can tell a difference between our traditional diet of whole natural foods and the modern diet of highly processed foods, you will be able to understand why we have an epidemic of obesity, why we have the visceral fat, and why we have the heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and autoimmune diseases that are dominating our population. This is the difference. It's what we put in our mouth. So we have a problem of addiction. It's addiction to chemicals we put in our food. It's chemicals we take in our substances like alcohol, various drugs. We've already demonstrated statistically it's exceedingly difficult to escape that pleasure trap. There is one thing that we advocate, it happens to be the topic of our new book, Can Fasting Save Your Life, is that fasting turns out to be an effective tool at helping escape the pleasure trap. For example, smokers that utilize fasting, often by the second day of fasting, report no withdrawal cravings. Fasting is also effective at helping break the dependence on salt, oil, and sugar, the dietary pleasure trap. And so, you know, can be a very helpful tool. It's what we do at the True North Health Center is promote medically supervised water-only fasting. We also provide remote support for people that aren't able to attend a facility. And so I think I probably should break here and allow the opportunity for questions you might have.
Thank you so much. You packed a lot into that short presentation. I had a question for you before I ask Ray to ask his question. You know, you said that we grew up in an environment of scarcity. That may be more appropriate for you people who went to Europe, who went to North America, where it was cold for a substantial portion of the year. Whereas people who went to tropical climates perhaps did not have the same environment of scarcity. So I have been, you know, postulating that this is why you talk about the pursuit of happiness, because when you're in an environment of scarcity, you're looking for happiness outside, you're hungry most of the time. Whereas people in the East were always talking about happiness being within us. You know, there's nothing to pursue.
Well, you know, it's interesting. For example, humans have a particular issue of challenge because of the brain. The brain's a huge bulbous neuronal net. It's our biggest burner of glucose. Chimpanzees, who may be our closest relatives, have large brains, but not as large as ours. They, nonetheless, will never leave the tropics. They will live in the tropics their entire existence, because if they do, if they wander away, they become vulnerable to starvation when spring comes late. And so they have to live in an environment of constant available food supply. That's why you'll never see chimps, you know, wandering around different environments. Humans wandered all over the planet, and all the humans that didn't have the ability to change their brain from burning fat to burning, from burning sugar to burning fat, that is the ability to fast. That's essentially what fasting is the ability to transform our brain fuel from sugar to fat. All the humans that didn't have that capacity died. This is a biological adaptation. Being able to burn fat was such a critical need because we wandered away from the tropics that now all human beings living anywhere on the planet have this capacity to do fasting, to change their brain fuel. And so a human being that didn't have the ability to fast would last about a week or so without food, because then it would enter gluconeogenesis, it would burn its protein reserves and die. But a 70-kilogram male can go about 70 days without eating because of this ability to switch to burning beta-hydroxybutyric acid in the brain. So this biological adaptation of fasting was so necessary to human survival because of our ridiculously large brains that we all eventually developed the ability to do this. Those that didn't have the ability didn't make it. Now all we're doing is taking this very natural ability to fast and using it in a very unnatural situation where people have access to unnaturally concentrated, high concentration food. So even in the tropics, the food still had low caloric density. So, you spent most of your energy trying to get enough to eat and not get eaten. It's only when we increase the caloric density of foods artificially that you can get into this situation of obesity and the disease of dietary excess. That's why these diseases used to be called the diseases of kings, because it was only the wealthy elite kings that could eat these highly concentrated substances that would allow them to become obese. People living in a natural setting were eating foods consistent with the types of foods we suggest people eat today.
Perfect. Ray?
Thanks, Dr. Goldhamer. It was an amazing presentation. I'm a big fan of your book. I read the book and handed it off to other people, and in the meantime, just refresh myself with the audiobook. And I recommend it to everybody, especially activists who are involved in the food space. My wife is involved in vegan outreach, and it's an interesting paradigm to introduce the idea that when we are indulging in even vegan junk food, vegan standard American diets, that we're essentially setting a trap. And sometimes we do it a bit tongue-in-cheek when we've got non-vegan family members who we want to impress with our vegan diet. What do we do to it? We load it up with the pleasure trap. We're essentially setting a trap. Is this a useful metaphor?
It's interesting that vegans oftentimes, a vegan diet, it just means there's no animal food, which is great. But, Coca-Cola is vegan, Oreo cookies are vegan, potato chips can be vegan. I sometimes get in trouble. I speak at national vegan conferences, and I point out that although, a vegan diet may help you get into heaven, it will not delay how quickly you get there unless you also go SOS free. And there's a lot of resistance amongst vegans because they feel like they've given up a lot, in order to accommodate their moral, ethical, and spiritual beliefs. But the health beliefs oftentimes lag in many vegans because many of them are driven by moral, ethical, spiritual, save the planet, save the animals, do the right moral and ethical thing. But, your own personal health can also be benefited, but you have to go beyond vegan. You have to go vegan, and then you also have to get rid of the chemicals added to food that are going to make you fat, sick, and miserable. A lot of vegans are very sick, even though they don't eat animal products because of these highly processed food components. And they're, in some cases, even more focused in trying to make up for the lack of animal products by using more sugar, oil, and salt. And so I like talking to vegans because, there's only half the battle left to fight, but there's still half the battle.
Yeah, I ask vegans to be compassionate to themselves as well. Self-compassion comes first.
That's I like that. I'm going to steal that.
Sure thing. Ken? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Really wonderful, wonderful. I'm a long-term vegan and 88 years old, and I need it. It's important. How do you compassionately guide people who are under tremendous work and time pressure with the questions of preparation of foods?
Yes, that's a very important point because most people are essentially hiring other people to prepare food for them when they go to restaurants or they buy highly processed foods. But let's go through a whole plant food SOS-free typical menu, and let's just see how if time is really a limiting factor. There are these places called grocery stores that actually sell products ready to eat. So one example might be a banana. So banana preparation is pretty simple. It's peel and eat. So you peel the banana and then you eat. Now you just eat the inside. The skin's kind of nasty. And some people say, but I want variety. I don't just want to eat the same food the same way every day. And that's fine. So I say Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you take the banana and you peel it from the top down. And then on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, you flip it over and peel it the other way. It's a completely different experience. Salad materials can be, you wash and chop, and then you eat them. So again, don't take a tremendous amount of time in order to have salad or fruit. Steamed vegetables. You can take starchy vegetables, put them in a steamer. It takes about 10 minutes. You can be doing other things while they're cooking. So again, probably not a big limiting factor. Potatoes, sweet potatoes, starchy vegetables. They take a couple minutes to cook in a microwave or 10 minutes in a steamer. Again, pretty simple. Even I can make those. We have 3 cookbooks at the Trinity Health Center. The Health Promoting Cookbook, the Bravo, and the Bravo Express cookbooks. Bravo Express cookbooks, no recipe has more than a half a dozen ingredients. All of them can be prepared in 5 minutes or less. So, you know, it is possible to come up with very simple, whole, natural foods that are simple to eat. And also, the cost of calories is very low. For example, there are several billion people on the planet that make less than $5 a day equivalent, and they tend to live on rice and beans, except on the weekends, beans and rice for variety and local vegetables. And so the cost per calorie for rice and beans is very, very low. So it's not really a time limiting issue. It's not really a cost limiting issue. It's really an addiction issue. We're addicted to the artificial stimulation of dopamine, and also the motivational triad for humans is pain avoidance, pleasure seeking, and energy conservation. So we're highly motivated to expend as little energy as possible to get as much pleasure as we can. And so we have to overcome these natural tendencies because we don't live in a natural environment any longer. We live in an environment been modified by the Industrial Revolution. And so we have to be cognizant of those changes. It is achievable, and time and money are not the limiting factors.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We also cook for multiple days, and we don't have leftovers, and we have encores.
Right, and we also have these devices like freezers where you can batch cook and then not have to you make big pots of soup. And also, is we try to get people outside, getting enough sunlight to get their vitamin D and get exercise so they can maintain strength, flexibility, and endurance. Gardening is a pretty nice thing because it does both. It gives you outside exposure, exercise, flexibility, stretching, and then you can grow food relatively easily. And even for people living in the city that don't have a lot of space, pot gardenings, you know, it's amazing how many cherry tomatoes you get off even one potted cherry tomato plant, how much greens you can grow. So you can make a substantial, and also people are spending tremendous amount of resources maintaining lawns and other things that may not be that environmentally sound. And that same space can be used to grow the fruit, the vegetables that a family eats. Fruit trees are particularly productive in terms of the amount of fruit that you can get. And now taking advantage of freezers and you know, other food drying techniques, you can actually make it cost-effective, environmentally sound, and health-promoting activity that the entire family can be involved with.
Yeah.
Thank you.
A question in the chat. Would you address being addicted to dried fruits like dates and nuts?
Right. So, well, nuts aren't necessarily dried, but dried fruits are highly concentrated. So you increase caloric density. So they're perfectly reasonable food if you're using them without preservatives and whatnot, but they are highly concentrated. So if weight control is an issue, the more you process the food, the more careful you have to be about quantitative utilization. So it's easy to overeat nuts and fruits. So if you have the ability to regulate quantity, that's fine. For example, nuts, we advocate most people limit their raw nut consumption to 1 ounce a day because we're looking for their total percentage of fat in their diet to be 15 to 80% of calories from fat, around 10% of calories from protein, with the balance coming from a whole plant carbohydrates. So nuts and seeds can certainly be an important part of the diet, but again, because they're highly concentrated, you just need to be careful about quantity.
Right.
I recommend nuts be used in the shell because by the time you shell 6 walnuts, you want to move on with your life. You know, the tendency to overeat is a lot less than when they're processed into nut butters and things like that.
True, true. Another question is, if someone can't afford going to a supervised fasting facility, is there a comprehensive book they could refer to?
Yes, our book, Can Fasting Save Your Life, provides the information necessary for people to go through fasting safely. And it provides their doctors the information they need to be able to monitor this process safely. But the reality is that many people, though, need to be extremely careful because they are on medications, they have health conditions. this is something that they will want to do in conjunction with their doctor, but their doctor can fast and save your life to get all the information necessary for people to undergo this process safely and effectively.
Question from Carol, which is, what about sea salt? Some of us need it for our circulation.
Yeah, sea salt is the advantage is it's contaminated with other minerals, so there's not as much sodium per serving. But the fact is that salt is salt is salt. Sodium chloride dissociates into sodium chloride, and you get all the salt you need from your whole plant food diet. You don't need to add salt any more than you need to add sugar, or you need to add oil in order to get enough essential fatty acids. And it's the addition of salt, including sea salt and Himalayan salt and pink salt and blessed by the guru salt, that's responsible for the passive overeating and the obesity. So, some people say, well, couldn't I have a little bit of salt and not have a problem? And the answer is, like, just as some people can have a drink and not become a drunk, if you're a drunk, it's not you. Some people are able to get away with a little bit of processed foods and not achieve obesity. But if you're overweight or struggling with obesity, it's not you. If you could have controlled it, you would have controlled it. It's not like you haven't tried. You've done everything you can. The reality is, just like an alcoholic has to learn, the answer is to not drink. A person that's dealing with obesity and its consequences has to learn they need to stop fooling their brain with the chemicals that make them fat and sick.
Yeah. She also asks, olive oil, I thought there was some goodness in it.
Well, olive oil may be less bad than some other oils, but something being less bad doesn't make it good. It just makes it less bad. Olive oil, like all oils, is 9 calories per gram of highly processed food. And so its constituents may have a more desirable fatty acid breakdown or something else. The answer is to eat whole plant foods, not highly processed foods. And olive oil, like all oils, will contribute to obesity and downstream consequences. It just has somewhat less bad characteristics than some other oils.
Right. And of course, the same question about coconut sugar or unrefined sugar.
Coconut sugars may have slightly less grams of sugar per volume, but it's sugar is sugar. And also the question is, what would you have to add sugar to? Highly processed grain-based products that you shouldn't be eating to begin with. Whole natural foods don't need to be sweetened in order to be able to be palatable. And so the more you process them, the more salt, oil, and sugar you need to have. What we've done is we've taken some federally subsidized grains like corn, soy, and wheat, and we've add salt, oil, and sugar to them, and that's what we call food. Go into the grocery store and just look at what most of the food is. If you go to Whole Foods Market, which was recently purchased for $16 billion by Amazon, you'll find there's not much whole foods in Whole Foods Market. Most of it's meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, oil, alcohol, and chocolate. There's a whole row of chocolate. So, yeah, there's some fruits and vegetables and grains, but 95% of sales and probably 99% of profit have nothing to do with whole foods.
Yeah. Well, she covered all three, SOS, a good salt, a good oil, and a good sugar.
Yeah.
BJ, what is that fab.svm? Would you like to ask? Oh, I'm sorry.
I apologize. That's something else.
That's something else. Okay. All right. Another one is, what are your thoughts on dried real fruit as snacks, such as dried mangoes, dried strawberries? My kid always wants snacks. Yeah.
Are highly concentrated, highly nutritious foods, particularly if you're getting them without sulfur and sugar and all kinds of other stuff. But again, because you've processed them, you've concentrated them, they have a much higher caloric density, so the tendency is to overeat. So if your goal is to get more calories in, for example, athletes and children, you're trying to build them up, that may have a potential role. But if your goal is weight control and fat control and disease control, then you want to be very cautious with dried fruits, just like you would with nuts and other concentrated foods, that you don't allow yourself to overeat on those substances.
Right. What about mushrooms in your diet?
So mushrooms can be highly nutritious foods. We recommend that mushrooms be used cooked, that there are some natural components in mushrooms raw that can be a problem, and some mushrooms can be quite nasty, shiitake mushrooms and whatnot in the raw state, and lead to some significant problems. But in the cooked state, heat breaks down many of the undesirable products, and so they can be products that add flavor, variety, and ostensibly healing components. So we utilize cooked mushrooms in the diet. And obviously you want to be careful that you're using edible mushrooms and not mushrooms that have, toxic or hallucinogenic properties.
Right. Another question is, do some programs have a better health and weight loss statistic than the 10% average you gave?
Do some
programs have perform better than the
well, yeah,
yeah.
some of them do perform better than others, but they all have an overwhelming failure rate. And even gastric bypass surgery and some of the most radical changes don't reduce all-cause mortality. So you may be able to sustain a certain amount of weight loss associated with the procedures, but you don't live longer and you certainly don't live better. And so we want to get realistic that the only way you solve alcoholism is to quit drinking. The only way you're going to solve obesity is to stop fooling the brains of the creatures with the chemicals that make them fat. This is not fundamentally a psychological problem. This is a biological problem. The psychology issues just make it harder to make behavioral and lifestyle changes. So I'm not saying psychology doesn't play a role, but if you take even the most damaged person psychologically, put them in an environment where they have no choice but a whole natural food diet, they will lose weight. Now, we do know that there are some people in our society that have more trouble losing weight than others. Those people are called women. Women are full of estrogen, which is a fat storage hormone. And so when women go on the same weight loss program that a male does, a typical woman will lose about 2 pounds a week, whereas a male will lose about 3 pounds a week, about 50% more, because the male is full of testosterone, which is a fat burning hormone. That's why if you inject women with enough testosterone, their fat melts off them. But then they get hairy and get cancer and die, so it's not a good strategy for weight loss. Men, on the other hand, if you inject estrogen into them, they'll get fat, they'll grow breasts and have hips. These are biological changes, not psychological changes. So what does that mean if you happen to be a woman? And a woman with good plumbing, that is, if she has healthy plumbing, that means when you think about it, the women that gain fat easily came from people that gained fat easily. They were what we call the winners. They were the survivors. They were the person that went on a long boat ride and survived and didn't die from starvation and get eaten by everybody else. The bottom line is, if you gain fat easily, that's a good thing biologically. It means you absorb what you eat well, and in a natural setting, you would be the winner. But in the modern environment with highly processed foods, you're screwed, because if you eat your fill of those foods, you will get fat easier than somebody else. Not because of psychology, but because of biology. And the consequences is you have to work twice as hard for half the results. And so, I don't make the rules, so don't get mad at me.
Yeah. One question, water fasting is a cure for follicular lymphoma. How many patients that have come to True North are cured? And why does it not work with everyone who conforms to an SOS?
Okay, well, first of all, I don't believe in the concept of cure. You can't cure obesity. You can lose the weight and keep it off, but if you go back to eating the greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh diet that made you fat, you'll get fat again. You're not cured, you're managed. You can't cure hypertension. We did a study, 174 consecutive patients with high blood pressure achieved normal blood pressure without medication, but they're not cured. If they go back to the salty processed foods, they'll get their blood pressure back. They're managed. And so this is strictly about management. Now, in the case of follicular lymphoma, this is a type of lymph cancer that we've published papers in the British Medical Journal showing the resolution of follicular lymphoma. One particular patient was a 42-year-old woman, had stage 3 follicular lymphoma, 2 years of progression, underwent 21 days of fasting at True North Health Center with a resolution of her tumor. We have 3-year and now 10-year follow-up data confirming that she is cancer-free. We've recently published a cohort, or a case series, looking at a number of follicular lymphoma patients, showing that they're able to manage this condition with fasting and a whole plant food SOS-free diet. We actually have a couple dozen patients that we're studying right now, looking for long-term follow-up outcomes. And so we do believe we'll be able to do a prospective assignment with controlled
randomized control trial.
That will show that follicular lymphoma can be best managed with fasting and a diet. So for people interested in looking at these studies, they can go to our website at truenorthhealth.com, and all of our studies and data is freely available there. So yes, it is a condition that responds to fasting. But unfortunately, people have to do dangerous and radical things. They have to keep eating well, exercising, and go to bed on time in order to maintain the results. So it's not that fasting cures it. It's fasting creates an environment where the body gets into remission. Diet, sleep, and exercise keeps people in remission. And as I said, we've got some cases now we've been able to show 10-year follow-up data. So
Wonderful.
very impressive, because under conventional treatment, even when you get temporary remission from chemotherapy, it tends to come back, blow up, and does not affect all-cause mortality, which is why it's considered ethical for us to do something like get people well.
I see. What about the blue zones? Have you
So in the
benchmarked
blue
to the
zones,
Seventh-day Adventist community?
yeah, blue zones, typically, they may not be vegan SOS free, but they typically, on average, have better health habits. And the closer they get to vegan SOS free diets, the healthier they're going to be. A lot of times people misattribute the benefits to, oh, they happen to have olive oil in the diet instead of eating as much meat, or they drank some red wine instead of eating as much meat. The fact is, as bad as meat is, there are some things that might be even worse than that. And that, these highly refined carbohydrates and highly processed foods. So the fact that you are less bad doesn't necessarily mean it's the olive oil, but the overall integrity of the diet, the fact that people are still eating some plant foods, getting some exercise. If you look at it more objectively, you realize the blue zones are just areas where people on average have better habits than in others. And when those individuals with those same genetic backgrounds adopt the diets of industrialized societies, they develop exactly the same problems we do. Sometimes it's even more dominant. So,
is the motivational triad that moves us towards pleasure, away from pain, and conserve energy an important human tendency that applies to life even beyond food?
Yeah, the motivational triad is the driving force of all human behavior. So we want to seek pleasure, i.e., things that naturally stimulate dopamine. Remember what those things are: food, and sex. We want to avoid pain, because pain tells us, oh, there's a problem. And we want to do it with as little energy as possible. The reason we're designed to conserve energy is we evolved in an environment of scarcity. So the people that lived long enough to reproduce were the ones that didn't waste their limited energy, because getting enough to eat and avoid being eaten was the biological imperative of life.
Right. Well, any other questions? Yeah, is good, clean coffee okay?
No. Coffee contains a highly addictive nervous system stimulant called caffeine, which has a 7-hour half-life. It disrupts the sleep quality. It irritates the heck out of your stomach, not just the caffeine, but the 2,000 other chemicals associated with coffee. Now, because some people don't eat any plants, it may be the only plant-based food that they eat, and may be a source of antioxidants and other things for them. And people love good news about their bad habits. So they'll take something like coffee and say, oh, well, there's something good in it. It's not. Or red wine. They'll say, oh, there's resveratrol. There's a powerful antioxidant. If you don't drink, you should start. When in reality, the resveratrol comes from the skin of grapes. If you want resveratrol, just eat some grapes. You don't have to drink wine in order to be able to get the nutrients you need.
Okay. That chuckling vegan, would you like to answer your question? Ask your question? Unmute yourself. Go ahead. We don't hear you. One more question from the chat. How about juice that's high in natural sugars?
So, again, the problem with juice is that, again, highly processed, and so it's higher in caloric density, easy to overeat, doesn't have the fiber that helps slow down the rate of absorption. So if you're trying to increase caloric density, it might have an advantage. But if you're trying to lose weight, probably better to eat whole fruit than processed juices.
Right. Then Paula had a question. I think I missed. But yeah, what about weight in terms of duration of fasting? Someone who's ideal or at the low end of weight range will not be able to stay on fast as long as someone who has weight to lose. Yeah.
A thin person is going to fast a shorter period of time than an overweight person. Sometimes we have to do several shorter fasts. But what's interesting is when the closer people get to optimum weight, the lower their weight loss is. So people, for example, as they get into fasting, will be losing as little as 2 pounds a week. whereas people that are overweight in the beginning of fasting may lose as much as 2 pounds a day. So you'd be surprised how long we can fast people safely in an environment of rest. But at True North Health Center, where we do medically supervised fasting up to 40 days, this is done in a medically supervised setting. There's history exam, lab, twice daily monitoring. And we've done this 25,000 times over the last 40 years. So we have a lot of experience at helping people identify if they're a candidate for fasting, how to fast, and how to recover after fasting. Refeeding after fasting is one of the most critical periods because you want to avoid refeeding syndrome and other things that can result in damage or death. Interestingly enough, for people that want to know if fasting is a good thing for you, we offer a free service. They can go to our website at truenorthhealth.com, complete the registration forms. I'll review their medical history, offer them a no-cost phone conversation to help point them in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldhamer. It's been amazing.